to speak to these matters, partly because before she was a PhD, she came to us after nearly 10 years of work with Cowichan tribes, and is typical of some of our students here who come out of the field, so to speak, to come back to school to grapple with problems they have encountered in the field that their training didn't serve them to address. And Jen is very much in that spirit and has tremendous on-the-ground and academic experience and expertise. So
Thank you.
welcome.
Thanks, Terry. So to begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Musqueam people, which is a fact that underpins why we're here to talk about reconciliation today. So following on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission national events in Vancouver, Terry asked me to give this talk to try and link the TRC with Indigenous sovereignty and questions about rights and title. And those are subjects that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and writing and researching about, so that's what I'm going to set out to do. So first of all, how many of you attended the events at the PNE? Any of you? A few? And were there some events here at UBC as well? Did some people attend events here? Yeah? Yeah. And the walk? Did people go on the walk? A few people? Okay. Does anybody want to share something that they learned or thoughts that they had about those events? No? People just want to hear me talk? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think there was lots of mixed reactions to the TRC in general, and also to the event. I know some people who didn't go specifically because they didn't want to go, and a lot of people who went in support or to learn more. So yeah, certainly both types of reactions to that. And certainly the federal government hasn't approached the TRC in a spirit of reconciliation in a lot of ways, so it's understandable that people would want to also not support the TRC. But I went feeling that I was going to learn more and support the survivors. So, yeah, well, great. Any other comments, or shall we move on to my talk? Okay. And talk?
No.
Did I go?
No. You said you had an objective.
Yeah, I did. I did learn more. I did have emotional responses that I think were good to have and to try and work through those. But yeah, it was good for me to go, I think, especially since I spent so much time thinking about it. Okay, so here's an outline of my talk, and I'm going to start by making a connection between residential schools and the dispossession of land and resources. And then, in order to set the stage for a focus on reconciliation, I'll give a brief overview of the history of colonialism and Indigenous state relations in Canada and BC. I will then review some of the components or goals of reconciliation discussed in the literature broadly. So when I talk about the literature on reconciliation, I'm talking about literature that has come out of research into reconciliation processes in the sort of post-Cold War era that have emerged in different places around the world, like South Africa or the former Yugoslavia, South America, to deal with mass atrocities. Then I will talk about some of the critiques of reconciliation, specifically within contexts of settler colonialism, like Canada. I will then go over a set of requirements that I drew from those literatures that are required for genuine reconciliation and apply those within the context of territorial governance. Next, I'll share some of the findings from my research, my dissertation research on new relationships and reconciliation between First Nations and BC, the province of BC. And finally, I'll start trying to make some links between reconciliation and the types of research that some of you may be doing, or the types of research that are done at IRES. And I hope you guys will pick up where my brainstorm left off and we can have a discussion about that. So any questions before I begin? So I will start by just, if any of you don't know, Canada established the TRC in 2008 as part of the Indian Residential Schools settlement, a class action settlement for former residential school students who took the federal government and churches to court. The Commission had a 5-year mandate to prepare a comprehensive historical record on the policies and operations of the schools, to make recommendations to government, to educate the public, and to commemorate former students. And as you'll see when I start talking about reconciliation theory, a lot of those different goals are goals generally of reconciliation processes. So now, because I'm a Luddite, I'm going to try and play this clip from Murray Sinclair, which might be a problem, but I will try. I didn't embed it, but we'll see if it works here.
Hello, everybody. I'm Murray Sinclair. I'm the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. I want to talk to you for a few minutes about the issue of reconciliation, something which, of course, is very important to us here at the Commission, but also is of interest and importance to a lot of people in Canada. One of the things that we at the Commission have discovered is that it took us a long time to get to this point in terms of the relationship between Aboriginal people in this country. 7 generations of children went through the residential schools. And each of those children who were educated were told that their lives were not as good as the lives of the non-Aboriginal people of this country. They were told that their languages, their cultures were irrelevant. They were told that their people and their ancestors were heathens and pagans and uncivilized. They needed to give up that way of life to come to a different way of living. At the same time that was going on, non-Aboriginal children in the non-Aboriginal school systems of this country were also being told the same thing about Aboriginal people. So as a result, many generations of children, including you and your parents, have been raised to think about things in a different way, in a wrong way, in a way that is negative when it comes to Aboriginal people. And we need to change that. It was the educational system that has contributed to this problem in this country. And it's the educational system, we believe, that's going to help us to get away from this. We need to look at the way that we educate children. We need to look at the way that we educate ourselves. We need to look at what it is that our textbooks say about Aboriginal people. We need to look at what it is that Aboriginal people themselves are allowed to say within the educational system about their own histories. In addition to that, We also believe that what's important when it comes to looking at the way that children are educated is to understand that because it took us so many generations to get to this point, it's going to take us at least a few generations to be able to say that we are making progress. We cannot look for quick and easy solutions because there are none. We need to be able to look at this from the perspective of where do we want to be in 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 generations from now when we talk about the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country. And if we can agree on what that relationship needs to look like in the future, then what we need to think about is what can we do today that will contribute to that objective. Reconciliation will be about ensuring that everything that we do today is aimed at that high standard of restoring that balance to that relationship.
Okay, so those thoughts about reconciliation focus on relationships, improving relationships, and on education. When we talk about reconciliation, however, we can be talking about many different things, and there are many different components of reconciliation. And I'll touch more on both of those things when I get into the theory on reconciliation. So to place the TRC in a broader context, it focuses on the residential school policy of the government. Countries like Canada that were built through settler colonialism employed a whole set of policies aimed at the elimination of Indigenous peoples. Whoa, thank you. Now I need to call in the support, I think. Is there somebody who can help me here? Is Marcy gone? Because this is clearly not my computer. That's the problem, I don't think.
Again?
That looks like
It needs to recognize it.
it's coming.
It's not recognizing it.
Thank you, Abby.
Is it?
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, I can do the rest. Thank you. Okay, now it's made it look really weird. All right. Okay, so I think I was in the middle of telling you how the TRC, or residential schools, were just one of a set of policies aimed at the elimination of Indigenous peoples. Europeans wanted to gain, it went again? I didn't do anything. I didn't. Seriously. Okay.
Try and get this back to you.
So, European.
Oh no, the next one is a blank anyway.
No, it's not. It's just, this is looking
It's not
weird.
representing?
Yeah, it's over here or something. This is not what it normally looks like, as you know.
Okay, sorry.
There, well, that's a bit better.
Yeah, but
So I don't know why it keeps cutting out, though. That's the
because-
problem.
yeah, I'll tell you why later.
Okay. So, well, tell me now so I don't keep doing whatever it causes.
I'll stand there and keep.
No, you don't need to stand here. That's all right. So where am I? I'm at this slide, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Good, good, good.
You need to read your notes?
I do.
Okay, fine. Go.
No, you don't have to stand
I'll
here.
sit here and
Truly. You can look at my back the whole time? All right.
very lovely it is too.
Thank you. Okay. As we move on here, so, yes. Europeans wanted to gain possession of lands and resources that belonged to Indigenous peoples, and so they tried to get rid of Indigenous peoples. Attempted elimination occurred directly through killing, indirectly through assimilative strategies like residential schools, and rhetorically through racist legal concepts, which I'll talk a bit more about later. So residential schools then were one type of injustice done to Indigenous peoples, but broader processes of reconciliation need to address all of the injustices that were done, including making Crown claims to sovereignty compatible with Indigenous rights and title. So we're moving on now to this brief history. I'll start with a personal account. So I was born and raised in Vancouver, but knew nothing of the Indigenous peoples whose land I inhabited or their rights and title when I was growing up. And it wasn't until I was 30 and started working for a First Nation on Vancouver Island that I began to learn about the history of colonialism and dispossession here. And that was an experience that made me acutely aware of the void in my and other Canadians' education. So that's why I'm going to go over a little bit of the history, just to put reconciliation in that historical context. And I'll start with a definition of Aboriginal rights, which are those rights that are due to Aboriginal peoples in Canada because of their sovereignty prior to the assertion of sovereignty by Britain, France, or Canada. And there's different categories of rights, including the right to land, which is Aboriginal title, resource rights like plant harvesting, hunting, trapping, or fishing, and political rights like right to self-government. So Aboriginal rights are a product of colonialism, as Indigenous interests need only be described as rights in the face of threats. And colonial powers, physical, economic, cultural, and administrative, were used to dispossess Indigenous peoples of their lands and resources and continue to be used to keep the colonial system in place. So BC is unique in Canada as it remains one of the few places where treaties were not signed and have not been signed between Indigenous peoples and the Crown. And this is because there was more than a 2-century gap between the colonization of the east and west of Canada. And the east was colonized at a time when First Nations had more military and economic power, and Britain recognized the sovereignty of First Nations. So Britain made treaties to establish relationships and purchase land. In the 19th century, however, relationships between First Nations and colonists changed because Europeans began to outnumber Aboriginal people. The focus of the economy shifted, making settlers want Indigenous lands and resources as opposed to their labor. And many settlers adopted an ideology of European superiority. So colonists began denying that Aboriginal rights existed and adopted policies of assimilation. And it was during that time that BC was colonized. So against the protests of First Nations, only a tiny portion of BC was set aside in reserves, and the rest was transferred to the Crown. So First Nations continued to resist colonialism through all means available to them, which included protest and direct action at the beginning, and then litigation after a law preventing them from pursuing land claims was rejected in 1951. So the first title case to reach the Supreme Court of Canada was Calder in 1973. And in that case, the Nisga'a were seeking a declaration that their title had never been extinguished. 3 of the justices ruled that their title still existed, 3 ruled it did not, and 1 dismissed the appeal on a technicality. The decision was seen as a victory for First Nations, and it convinced the federal government to start negotiating land claims where treaties were not signed. The province held out, though, until 1990, and then the tripart BC treaty process began in 1993. So the next title case to reach the Supreme Court was, after Calder, was Delgamuukw in 1997. So Delgamuukw was a significant moment in the history of Canada, and specifically BC, because the continuing existence of Aboriginal title was affirmed in the absence of treaties, and settler governments were required by the Supreme Court to consult First Nations on decisions that might affect their lands. The resulting changes in provincial policy gave First Nations an entry point into renewed participation in territorial governance, which they have since leveraged into greater power, and that power is manifest in a variety of governance arrangements, including co-governance and Indigenous governance. So you may notice that I sometimes refer to the reconciliation of Aboriginal title and Crown claims to sovereignty, or the Crown's asserted title. I realize that this may seem biased, but it is a perspective that's drawn from an understanding of Aboriginal law, Indigenous rights, and contemporary Indigenous state relations. I make a distinction between title and asserted title because even within the Euro-Canadian legal system, Aboriginal title derives from the more solid ground of the laws of Indigenous peoples who have occupied the land since time immemorial. Land in BC was taken from Indigenous peoples in contravention of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which established that by British law, treaties must be signed to obtain First Nations land. Crown sovereignty was simply asserted, and attempts to explain its legality are based on the racist theory that Indigenous societies were not sufficiently evolved to be worthy of title. So, as explained by John Borrows, a faithful interpretation of the rule of law to the Crown's assertion of title throughout the country would suggest that Aboriginal peoples enjoy the very right the Crown claims. And from an Indigenous legal perspective, clearly, Crown claims to sovereignty are also not legitimate. So now that I've just whipped through a couple of centuries of history on a couple slides, I'll give reconciliation theory the same treatment. So I would encourage anyone who wants to read more about the history of Indigenous state relations in Canada to check out the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples that came out in 1996 and is available on the internet. So when I told you earlier what I mean when I talk about reconciliation theory. So there's a broad consensus in that literature that truth is a necessary first step in reconciliation processes, but that it must not be the only goal. Once there is both knowledge and acknowledgement of what happened, you start to begin to think about justice. And there's obviously different types of justice. In the complex context of responding to profound injustice and reconciling divided societies, restorative justice is the sort of focus of justice, generally speaking. Unlike punishment, it seeks to repair the injustice, to make up for it, and in so doing, repair social connections and peace. Restorative justice focuses on reparations, which includes restitution, or the return of rights or property, compensation, or the giving of something to make up for an unjust justice, apologies, and acts of remembrance, such as public art or days of remembrance, new historical narratives, or programs of education. So reconciliation then, as I've already mentioned, has different meanings. It can be used broadly to refer to processes aimed at building peace after injustice, or it can be used more specifically to refer to the one goal in these processes, improving relations between individuals or groups. It also refers to both processes and outcomes, but there's a general consensus in the literature that for long-term peace, macro-level reconciliation requires concrete action to address substantive injustices, things like legislative, political, institutional, and educational reform. So there are many critiques of reconciliation, especially in the context of settler colonialism. Some of these critiques are concerned with the concept and some with processes of reconciliation. So first of all, the term reconciliation is vague. It's not clear who or what is being reconciled with whom or what. It has Christian roots, which is problematic given the active participation of Christian churches in the attempted assimilation of Indigenous peoples. It suggests compromise, a give and take on each side, which suggests the parties share equal blame for past events. But in the case of settler colonialism, the parties don't share equal blame, and the problem with compromise is that it favors the dominant party. Reconciliation also implies that there were previously good relations, which is often not the case. And finally, it suggests finality and closure, putting the past behind us or closing a sad chapter in our history, as Stephen Harper stated in his residential school apology. But it's important to keep scars visible and make non-Indigenous Canadians responsible for knowing their history. And it is also important that we acknowledge that colonial violence and policies continue today and require eradication before we can close any chapters in our history. Reconciliation sometimes doesn't acknowledge the ongoing dynamic process that is required to achieve justice and decolonization. So in addition to the conceptual problems, there are also serious concerns with processes of reconciliation after settler colonialism. So other than the overarching goal of peace, the objectives of the two sides can often be quite different. And so in situations where there's that strong imbalance of power, processes are vulnerable to control and co-optation by the more powerful state. The state controls the land, resources, governance, and finances of indigenous communities. It also has the physical force to maintain that control. And given those conditions, it follows that the state can control any process of reconciliation. The asymmetry of power means that the state's objectives of legitimizing itself and creating economic and political certainty often override questions of justice. So some also argue that state-controlled processes are also assimilationist. For example, by enrolling indigenous people into the project of neoliberal governance to the extent that it becomes difficult for them to assert difference in any way contrary to the prevailing political and economic norms. So, to summarize, conceptions of reconciliation that continue to give disproportionate power to the colonizing state are not appropriate in situations of settler colonialism. The processes need to provide room for indigenous visions to coexist with non-indigenous ones, and particular attention needs to be paid to ensuring that indigenous aspirations are paramount. So the ultimate goals of reconciliation can be seen as freedom for indigenous peoples and peaceful coexistence between indigenous and settler peoples and governments. These goals require decolonizing settlers and their governments and institutions. The following processes are needed to achieve this decolonization: creating a nation-to-nation relationship of mutual respect, observing indigenous title and sovereignty, and dismantling colonial systems of governance, making other reparations, including restituting, compensating, apologizing, and remembering, and decolonizing settlers. Now, to apply those requirements in the context of territorial governance. Decolonizing territorial governance ought to include settler governments acknowledging and apologizing for colonialism, indigenous and settler governments creating nation-to-nation relationships, creating respectful relationships between politicians and staff of indigenous and settler governments at all levels, settler governments observing indigenous title and rights over each First Nation's entire territory, settler governments supporting the continuance of local indigenous laws and institutions, both governments co-creating systems of co-governance where First Nations agree to share jurisdiction, indigenous governments collecting resource revenues over their entire territories and sharing revenues in co-governance areas, and settler governments compensating indigenous peoples for lost land, resources, and opportunities. So those decolonizing processes are possible within two systems of governance: indigenous territorial governance and co-governance of indigenous territories. Business as usual, or unilaterally imposed and enforced crown title and governance, is not a part of decolonized territorial governance. So enough about theory, I'd say. Hey, Hattie? Did you stay awake? Yeah. Okay. So now I'll share some of my research findings, starting with my research questions. So my first research question was conceptual and asked about the meaning of reconciliation within the specific context of settler colonial states, which I just went over, some of the findings of that research. My second question was about how relationships between First Nations and BC have changed since Delgamuukw. Third question was about how the reconciliation of Aboriginal title and Crown claims to sovereignty are being reconciled. And the final question asked what, at this time, First Nation and provincial decision makers understand reconciliation to mean. So I'll break up my findings into a section on new relationships and one on reconciliation. and I'll start with the new relationships. So first I used documentary evidence to examine how relationships between the provincial government and First Nations have changed since Delgamuukw. And one way to assess the relationships between the parties is to look at the different engagement strategies that are being used and whether the party is meeting its goals using that strategy. And by engagement strategy, I mean the ways that the parties approach each other to resolve a conflict or underlying dispute. Now I've listed on the slide all of the different strategies that I examined, but I'll only talk about the last two because they are the ones that have changed the most in the past 15 years since Delgamuukw. So consultation became an engagement strategy primarily because of Delgamuukw. The Supreme Court instructed Crown governments to consult with First Nations on decisions that may infringe Aboriginal title. So Chief Justice Lemaire said, "The fiduciary relationship between the Crown and Aboriginal peoples may be satisfied by the involvement of Aboriginal peoples in decisions taken with respect to their lands. There is always a duty of consultation. In most cases, it will be significantly deeper than mere consultation. Some cases may even require the full consent of an Aboriginal nation. The economic aspect of Aboriginal title suggests that compensation is relevant to the question as well. Fair compensation will ordinarily be required when Aboriginal title is infringed." So this meant that the provincial government had to consider the effects of its actions on and initiate a different type of relationship with First Nations. Because Delgamuukw dealt with Aboriginal title and most of the province is subject to land claims, virtually every land and resource decision taken by the province requires consultation with at least one and usually more First Nations. So this was a radical change in the way that decisions are made in the province. Delgamuukw also talks about accommodation, or how the government takes care of the interests of Aboriginal peoples. The new relationship of consultation and accommodation had a rocky start. The government resisted quite strongly, but constant litigation by First Nations forced the government to begin to take First Nations concerns seriously and ultimately led to other new relationships. So the evolution of relationships between First Nations and BC is not linear, nor is it neatly divided into phases. It's more of a collage or a mashup as groups add new strategies onto the mix they are using or revive old strategies when new strategies prove unfruitful. Relationships improve, degenerate, and improve again. In the early 2000s, government-to-government processes, or G2G, became a significant aspect of the Central and North Coast land and resource management planning processes, taking it from a theoretical concept to an institutionalized approach. In 2005, the province and First Nations leadership entered into the new relationship, capitalized, formally acknowledging the changing nature of their relationship. Several reconciliation protocols have been signed between First Nations and the province since 2009. These include frameworks for shared decision-making, revenue sharing, and access to economic opportunities. The Haida Reconciliation Protocol is the only one that includes what is termed joint decision-making, a more equal form of co-governance that requires consensus of both parties on some decisions. The others only have shared decision-making, in which the province makes the final decision. Using the requirements for genuine reconciliation I presented earlier, I argue that for each of the engagement strategies, the relationship between BC and First Nations is still colonial. The province still needs to acknowledge and apologize for colonialism and its impacts, observe Indigenous title and rights in practice and not just in theory, relinquish territorial control, co-create systems of joint and not just shared decision-making, negotiate a fair sharing of resources and revenues, and determine approaches to compensation. So in addition to analyzing documents, I interviewed people who were engaged in new relationships between First Nations and BC. So different policymakers, leaders, decision makers on both sides. So they're in a unique position to describe First Nation BC relationships as they're unfolding and provide perspectives on reconciliation as individuals who wrestle with the dynamic process every day. And because a lot of them were in sort of high positions within either government, They have often been involved in those relationships over quite a period of time, so they could reflect on how things had changed since Delgamuukw. So in considering changing relationships, the people I interviewed talked about leveling the playing field. They talked about it directly using the idiom, and they talked about the concept attached to the idiom, that of balancing the power of the parties. In the answers that interviewees gave to questions about colonialism, Aboriginal rights, and relationships between First Nations and BC, there is a recognition of the need to share power and the colonial nature of the relationship, both in the past and in the present. Although that recognition was very uncomfortable for some of them. So this quote from a BC decision maker is one of the more succinct responses to my question, how would you characterize, oh, not again. I didn't do anything. It is the cable's fault, thank you. Do I have to pull it out again, do you think? Can I see it? Yeah, but you guys want to see my picture. I know you do.
I'd rather hear your voice.
No.
Come on.
Does something happen up there that I need to look for? Okay. It's not coming?
No,
And you're not going to come and help me this time?
no.
Oh, Hadi. Come on.
Share the decision making. Come on. Tell us the rest of it.
I'll read you the quote if you come and get it back up on the screen.
Don't wait for me. Just keep going.
Okay, so this was an answer to the question, how would you characterize the current relationship between First Nations and BC? That's a good question. I mean, I think we've come a long way, right? You look at it, in the last 5 years, we've come a tremendous way. But I don't think it will be fully, considering we've got this 100-year or 150-year history since, and even longer, since the white man made first contact with First Nations. Now it's gone. I think we've made tremendous progress in the last 10 years. But it might not be solved in our lifetime. It's coming.
There we go. Come right there.
That?
That one.
That one?
Yeah.
Oh, look it. I learned something new. Oh, no, maybe I didn't. Yes, I did. Okay, thank you. I'll try not to touch anything. It's really hard when you have to advance the slide. Okay, so to summarize the research on relationships, it's clear that the two parties are still not on equal footing, and there's a long way to go with improving relationships. However, decision makers on both sides acknowledge that relationships have changed dramatically. From their answers and my analysis of relationships using documentary evidence, I argue that systemic change has taken place. First Nations have negotiated formal power at different political and bureaucratic levels, and also informal access to power. Despite these dramatic changes, the relationship remains colonial. This is evidenced in the ongoing imbalance of governing and negotiating power, and in persisting colonial structures and attitudes. The provincial government continues to maintain power by relying on its unilaterally imposed laws and the resources it appropriates. I also asked my interviewees about reconciliation, and I'll read you 2 quotes from the interviews. The first is from Dallas Smith, the president of the Nanwakolas Council, an alliance of First Nations on northern Vancouver Island. And he said, "And we've just taken an incremental approach. Shovel by shovel has gotten us farther than the big combine of the treaty process has been trying to do for years. So what we've really learned, bite-sized pieces is the way to go. And I think that's the only path to reconciliation, because the government is so vast. All the decisions that they make, all the governance, all the policy is so huge that you can't do it in one bite. You sort of got to take a bite, look at the next piece, take another bite, look at the next piece. And that's really the path to reconciliation, is standing up and saying, okay, we can go forward based on this governance model collectively, acknowledging our Aboriginal rights and title and the right to the Crown. We can go forward based on that. And to me, that's reconciliation at the end of the day. And the second quote is from one of the provincial employees. The Supreme Court is really smart. Governments have consistently, by their own sort of political logic, have talked about reconciliation as being a place. And the courts have consistently talked about reconciliation as being a process. I think even most recently, when you look at the Little Salmon case that came out of the Yukon, they were really clear. It was black and white. If you have modern treaties, that's good. But don't think you're done. Those things are good because they clarify. They give structure and form to our relationship. But they're not the end. You will never reach the end. So these quotes summarize the general feeling of the decision makers I spoke to about reconciliation. First, it is an incremental and ongoing process and not a goal. And second, they focused on reconciliation as co-governance and not as treaty settlement. These two ideas can be related to two components of reconciliation in settler colonialism: reconciling Indigenous state relations and reconciling competing claims to title and rights in the following way. By reconciling Indigenous state relations through developing an ongoing process of co-governance, the need to reconcile competing claims to land and resources may be eliminated. So in my interviews, I asked decision makers for First Nations and BC several questions about reconciliation, such as, what do you think the goals of reconciliation should be? What are the barriers to reconciliation? What does the process of reconciliation need to involve? What are some specific ways to reconcile the legal conflict between Aboriginal title and the Crown's asserted sovereignty? And they described four main components of reconciliation. With regard to the first component, building relationships and trust, interviewees described how trust is built through personal relationships that develop at multiple bureaucratic and political levels by both sides working together over time. These multi-level relationships and structures ensure that both strategic and practical issues can be addressed. The second component, closing socioeconomic gaps and creating sustainable economies, was highlighted by many interviewees and is arguably a part of reconciliation, but it cannot eclipse other fundamental components of decolonization. The third component, co-governance with a common vision, can be an important part of resolving dual title if power imbalances are addressed and ultimate authority is shared. The fourth component, building capacity, is important for both the province and First Nations, but First Nations continue to bear the burden of learning and using Euro-Canadian systems and have to overcome the effects of colonialism on internal governance processes and structures. So, this is a wordle of my dissertation, and because I love wordles, I thought I would include it as I summarize the research findings. First Nation Crown relations have improved in BC, and First Nations are regaining governance power. Settler governments are realizing that they cannot create certainty for themselves and investors through full and final treaty settlements. Many First Nations have rejected that treaty model, and for those nations with treaties, post-treaty relations with BC have not been without conflict and, in some cases, litigation. There's a realization among policy and decision makers that reconciliation needs to be an incremental and ongoing process, and that certainty is found through building good relationships. Incremental processes allow Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments to try out new relationships and take risks, knowing that there are opportunities to make changes if their goals are not being realized. And they allow Indigenous and non-Indigenous community members to become comfortable with change. As Ross Wilson, one of my interviewees, pointed out, I don't think people are afraid of big change. They're afraid of fast change. So before I bring the discussion out to research more generally, are there any questions about the first part of my presentation, or the whole of my presentation other than the slide? Yes.
You said that there are particular questions in which there is
Decisions.
joint decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Give me examples of what is joint?
One of them is, for example, the annual allowable cut determination. That was the first decision that was made actually within that reconciliation protocol as a joint decision. I think more of the, some of the more administrative ones are probably the shared ones where it's more of a, you have time to give your input and then the provincial decision maker will just make the decision.
Royalties from the cover shared one.
There are, it depends on the resource that you're talking about. In forestry, it's generally a formula that has something to do with, it was actually originally it was a per capita type arrangement for forestry revenues to go back to First Nations. But then there were complaints because there were some where lots of logging was taking place in their territory and some where it wasn't. So now it's more related to the logging that's taking place in that territory. And I don't know exactly how it's worked out. It's not like just a straight percentage or anything like that. Okay. Yeah, I will get there. But in a couple of words, just talking about educating and re-educating ourselves about the history and about relationships, and also changing sort of patterns of thought and trying to challenge racist stereotypes, things like that. That's right. Yeah. No, it's a good point. I mean, I think, and I'm supposed to repeat the question for the video, but I'm okay, good. So that's a very good point, and it's something that is talked about a lot. I think if people who grew up here need to re-educate themselves, people who come here also need to educate themselves, even if they don't have to then necessarily change stereotypes that they've learned, but just learn the histories that are of the place that they are in. There's also a lot of talk about, well, why should I, have to, if I'm a newcomer to Canada, why should I have to deal with this because it happened a long time ago? But we all, newcomers to this continent, whether it's now or several generations ago, are all benefiting from what happened with colonialism. All of the resources, all of the the economy, all of that is based on this dispossession and colonialism. So we're all benefiting from it, so we also all need to challenge it. You mean the political dynamics as in people don't know about it?
I'm trying to elaborate. Imagine there is a territory that I, as a white settler family, came and my kin is still living.
Mm-hmm.
That is materially different with the same territory having been sold as sanctioned by the province to a third party who might now be from China.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And
Oh, well.
so, for example, actually in the law, taking possession of something which was stolen, but in good faith, does not allow you to be dispossessed of that because it was initially stolen.
Right. So there's a lot of work on this in philosophy to figure out how to deal with taking responsibility for the past and who should bear that burden. And I won't go into deep detail, but there's a very good book called Taking Responsibility for the Past, which goes into all of these different questions and argues for why we should take responsibility for the past, whether we are the new taker or the old taker. So, yeah. Layla? So the question is around territory and what that encompasses, traditional territories, that sort of thing. I'm doing this for the camera. So I don't know specifically your question. There's a lot of work on what's termed traditional territory and how a lot of the sort of lines that are drawn on a map, I don't know if this is the question that you're getting at, are also a product of colonialism and a product of some of these processes of treaty making and reconciliation processes, and cause a lot of problems because it's not the way that territories were defined in the past. There's lots of conflict over those either shared or overlapping territories, depending on how you want to look at it. I don't know if there's a specific question in there, but yeah, just to talk a bit about that. Yeah, it's a huge issue and has caused a lot of problems between neighboring nations. And I mean, currently one of the ways of overcoming that issue, I mean, when the treaty process was first started, it was all of the sort of smaller nations, or not always smaller, but in general it was often sort of smaller nations that started the process with the provincial and federal governments. But over time, in these outside the treaty process types of relationships that I'm talking about, nations have come together in a lot of cases to negotiate with the province in order to get rid of those issues and deal with them internally. And on the province's part, I mean, in their case, they would like to deal with a fewer number of nations as well. So it works in both ways in some cases. In other cases, it doesn't work for nations if they either don't have a larger group to belong to or whatever. So, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, and I think that sort of shift from let's look at it as a goal, like we need to get to somewhere and call it done. That shift to no, actually, we need to think about this as an ongoing relationship that you're never going to get to the end of, is very much more aligned to, sort of, if you want to talk about generalized indigenous ideas about reconciliation, they are much more about relationships than they are about, oh yeah, we just need to settle the score or whatever. So, yeah, I think that's very true. Yeah, I mean, I think they talked about lots of different strategies. I mean, part of it for BC, which is it's actually very fascinating, because when people stop to check and make sure that you're going to make sure that they're anonymous and their comments aren't attributed. You know they're talking about something that's a bit of a sore spot. So for some of the BC interviewees, one of the parts where they said, no, this isn't attributed, right, was when they were talking about resourcing and how there's not enough resourcing for relationships with, for example, nations that have already signed treaties. So the province's sort of model is we get to the agreement, then we move on to the next nation and try and settle that treaty, and the resourcing goes way down. And so, from the provincial side, a lot of it was talking about making sure that there's resourcing for those relationships. On the First Nations side, there's a lot of talk and focus on capacity building. And again, it comes from all sorts of different angles, from just like sort of resourcing, getting more resource revenue, to education, to rebuilding indigenous governance structures. So yeah, lots of different strategies.
Can I give you a concrete example of this? I think part of the RCE is the remote community electrification negotiation for a community in central BC. BC
Right.
So, no, I think that there is an intent which is not carried out. And I would say that these people who have been working for 5 years really lack the capacity to make informed judgment about the risk.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it is the area that I'm working in right now, and so yeah, giving another sort of concrete example, I work on the central and north coast. I work with nations on the central and north coast in Haida Gwaii, and in each of those nations that I work with, they are developing stewardship offices, and they've been able to do that largely because there is now resource revenue coming in. So they're having, instead of program dollars, they're having an ongoing funding for those positions. So now that they have people that can stay in those positions and not go and get another job, they're starting to be able to build capacity. But it is a really, really long, slow process of, if people don't have higher education, for example, in specialties like biology or whatever, in order to interface with a government that uses these systems, they have to hire consultants. And so yeah, there's definitely lots of focus on that. Mm-hmm. Kai. Put it on the table for governments? For the public or for governments? Well, for governments, it's been court cases. I mean, that is what's put it on the table, and that's what's caused the change, I would argue. It's definitely been the court cases where they've said, you have to do this. And then they keep saying, actually, you have to do this. Actually, you have to do this. And so slowly over time, they've been doing that. Of changing things. So I'd say in the government-to-government circles, the conversation is happening. It's being figured out, and things are definitely changing. I would say in the broader public, I was actually quite happy to see the turnout at the Reconciliation Walk. I think there hasn't been a lot of engagement by the public on these topics, and I mean it's hard for me because I'm so immersed in it to know how much other people talk about these issues, but my sense is not that much. My sense is that people really don't understand the history very much, and they don't understand Aboriginal law, that our title is inferior, as that the provincial and federal title is inferior. So yeah, I mean, I think broadening that discussion out into the public is very important, and that's partially what I hoped to achieve a bit here, was to talk about, in your research, now that I've talked for so long, but I'm sure everybody is already thinking about this, but, to just sort of start talking about what this means from a research perspective in the work that we all do, because most people, I would say here, deal with resources and land in some aspect, in any case.
I have, you said your ideas, I have an idea.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, clearly we're all on territories that belong to us, and they've been dispossessed. Bill McDonough had this lovely idea about 20 years ago, in which he said that no one actually owns their own home. It's owned by the municipal government, and the municipal government, through their real estate taxes, exert a lease type of unit. You think you own title to your home, but in fact through the lease
loves a controversy.
Yeah, but the point is, it's not like we don't have mechanisms.
No, it's true. It's just about making those decisions. I mean, it's the same with sharing, in quotes, forestry revenues, mining revenues, all those things. 10 years ago, no way. It wasn't even on the table. Now it's a part of it, and so it's just about changing mindset.
But this would also address the kind of questions that Michelle asked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Is that all the questions? Do we have time? Do we have to
No.
wrap? We want to wrap now? We want to talk about this more? Talk about this with me another time? Yeah, sure. I mean, that's okay. I won't talk anymore. Now I'll wiggle it and see what, look at that.